Welcome, everyone. We're going to give everybody another minute or so to hop on. Good afternoon, everyone. Um, we'll get started. I'll talk for a little while so that we can give people a chance to hop on. Welcome to week 8 of our fall semester colloquium series on migrations. We've had wonderful talks this semester. It's hard to believe that we're past the midway point. We've had wonderful talks. I hope you've been able to join us for some of them. We have covered the history of Chinese migrations, US immigration policy and law, the Underground Railroad as resistance through migration. We've talked about farm workers in the US and also in Asia, and COVID-19 last week through the lens of public health and migration. These have been really wonderful talks, and I feel lucky to have been able to participate in them. I think they really do build to a very exciting interdisciplinary, multi-species, cross-temporal and cross-regional perspective on migrations. We're excited to welcome Wendy as this week's speaker. She'll be presenting on behalf of a larger research team, but I'll introduce Wendy and then she can introduce the team and the project. So Wendy is a postdoctoral fellow this year with the Migrations Initiative. She's hosted by the Einaudi Center for International Studies and by Cornell's Lab of Ornithology. She came to Cornell in 2019 as a postdoctoral fellow supported by the American Association of University Women, located in the Lab of O and the Center for Conservation Bioacoustics. Wendy really embodies the interdisciplinarity, I think, that runs through the Migrations Initiative. She was trained in zoology and anthropology with a minor in Spanish, getting a PhD from Stony Brook University in anthropology in 2012. She identifies as a tropical field and behavioral ecologist who's broadly interested in the influences of the environment and physiology on the behavioral and reproductive strategies of wildlife. She works with some of the most charismatic fauna on the planet, with langurs, tamarins, orangutans, and gibbons. Her research program combines natural history, ecology, animal behavior, and conservation, and she's one of the leading experts on primatology and demography, publishing widely in these fields. So I'll turn it over to Wendy. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Wendy, and thanks to all of you out there in cyberspace who are joining us this afternoon. I am going to start sharing my screen now, and hopefully this goes smoothly. Okay. Okay, we should be up and running now. So as you all know, today we're going to be talking about the ecology of state building, moving capitals in Indonesia. And before we kick off the content of today's talk, I would like to make an acknowledgement of the indigenous people that have called the area where I'm seated right now in Ithaca, New York, home for centuries. So this is a statement prepared by the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program at Cornell University. Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Cayuga Nation. The Cayuga are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America, and we acknowledge the painful history of Cayuga dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of the Cayuga people, past and present, to these lands and waters. Worldwide, humans are confronting the impacts of anthropogenic climate change, warming temperatures, changing weather, rising sea levels, and extreme storms and heat waves, droughts, and floods that are becoming our new norm. In turn, this is having serious implications for our water supply, crop production, health, and economic growth, with some parts of the world much more affected than others. Climate change can bring both fast and slow onset events. So whereas fast onset events like floods, storms, and hurricanes tend to lead to sudden, involuntary, and short-term movements, slow onset events, as described by the United Nations, are, like droughts and land degradation, commonly result in mobility, which is perceived as voluntary and often predominantly economically motivated. And in both ancient and recent history, there are examples abound in which people have responded to extreme weather conditions and environmental change by moving out of regions into other areas. So we have one famous example from American history. This is described as one of the largest migrations in American history, when roughly 2.5 million people left the Dust Bowl states of Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma in the 1930s. So after the Civil War, there were a series of federal land acts, such as the Homestead Act of 1862, which provided settlers with 160 acres of public land that coaxed pioneers westward by incentivizing farming in the Great Plains. And this led to a massive influx of new and inexperienced farmers to the region. So a short-sighted and ill-advised farming practices known as the Great Plow-Up was adopted when farmers, again, who were new to this ecology, gouged out huge swaths of topsoil to plant wheat, which led to a wide-scale transformation of this delicate ecosystem. So when droughts arrived in 1930, as they commonly did to this region, a regular cycle in the Great Plains, massive dust storms sucked up this newly plowed earth and often turned day into night. And a series of drought years followed through the end of that decade, further exacerbating this environmental disaster. And because this drought continued for many years, a lot of families realized that these dust storms would not end soon, sold what they could not take, and headed west, whereas others remained, many of them suffering health problems and deep poverty while waiting for the return of the rains when they eventually came in 1939. So even though much of the early discourse on climate change migration framed the issue as a refugee crisis, more recently, the discourse has shifted, it's evolved. This climate change migration nexus is more complex and nuanced than an involuntary forced response to exogenous stimuli. So instead, there's now a growing acknowledgement that it's an essential element of human security, playing a central role in adaptation more generally. So in this 2018 report from the World Bank, focusing on 3 regions, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America, that represent over half of the developing world's population, projected that by 2050, climate change will push over 143 million people, about 3% of these regions' populations, to migrate within their own countries by 2050 from areas with lower water availability and crop productivity, and from areas that are affected by rising sea level and storm surges. And of course, the poorest and most vulnerable climate areas will be hardest hit. Indonesia, a Southeast Asian nation of over 17,000 islands, has been identified as one of these most vulnerable countries to climate change, already impacted by warming temperatures and changing rainfall patterns connected to seasonal flooding and droughts. Weather-related disasters like forest fires, landslides, storms, and drought have destroyed infrastructure and degraded forest and coastal ecosystems, leading to the loss of life, property, ecosystem services, and livelihoods. And with 81,000 kilometers of coastline and 42 million people living in low-lying land less than 10 meters above sea level, Indonesia is particularly vulnerable to sea level rise. Rising seas are projected to submerge 2,000 of the country's smaller islands by mid-century, and coastal flooding is predicted to affect 6 million people a year by 2100. Within Indonesia, the capital megacity of Jakarta is particularly at risk due to its really high population density and exposure to environmental hazards. So Jakarta is not only vulnerable to rising seas, but also experiencing a number of environmental hazards in a rapidly growing population of over 10.6 million. Air quality in Jakarta has declined dramatically over the last few years due to vehicle emissions, nearby coal-fired plants, forest fires that ravage Indonesia regularly, as well as open waste burning. And air particulate concentration there is well over WHO guidelines. Now, Jakarta is naturally flood prone and tends to do so during those seasonal monsoon rains. A history of coastal and riverine flooding is there, but it's been made worse by the city's waterways being clogged with sediment from deforested land upstream, as well as garbage. And compounding changing climate, Jakarta is also one of the fastest sinking cities in the world, with parts of the city having sunk as much as 4 meters in the last 4 decades, intensifying these risks of flooding and sea level rise. So when I was in Indonesia just the beginning of this year, heavy rainfalls caused severe flooding that displaced over 400,000 residents and killed over 60 people. So in response to these concerns, last April, Indonesia's newly re-elected President Jokowi announced the decision that the country would become among the first to initiate a climate migration by relocating its capital city. And it's hoped, of course, that this migration will alleviate some of those risks, while at the same time more fairly distributing political power and contributing to Jokowi's vision of green growth and development throughout the archipelago. Well, given its geographic location, sort of in the center, east-west center of the archipelago, Borneo was quickly identified as a likely destination for the country's new seat of government. And while many outside observers have expressed surprise by this announcement, actually the idea is not new and has been floated by multiple Indonesian presidents since the country's inception. In fact, Indonesia's first president, Sukarno, initiated construction of the city of Palangkaraya as the capital of the newly established Central Kalimantan province in central Borneo, with the ambition that the city would one day replace Jakarta as the newly founded country's capital. Legend has it that one day, Sukarno calculated the precise location of the geographical center of Indonesia, inserted a pin there, and declared that this is where the new capital would be constructed. At the same time, a national program to promote mass migration from the island of Java to other parts of the archipelago, including Borneo, is also not new. The so-called Transmigration Program has been described as the world's largest program for voluntary assisted migration, a policy first initiated by the Dutch colonial government in the early 19th century to reduce crowding and provide a workforce for plantations on Sumatra. The program continued after the country's independence and expanded to send migrants to even more areas of the archipelago. So we can see here, looking at the distribution of people from Java throughout the archipelago in 2010, there are Javanese people settled in all parts from east to west in the Indonesian archipelago. So at its peak between 1979 and 1984, almost 2.5 million people moved from crowded, environmentally degraded islands of Java, Madura, Bali, and Lombok. And although it's promoted as a way to improve economic prosperity for migrants, this program was also a deliberate state-building strategy to shape Indonesia's national identity by assimilating and erasing native cultures, as demonstrated by the statement from the Minister of Transmigration in the mid-1980s. So he said, by way of transmigration, we will try to integrate all the ethnic groups into one nation, the Indonesian nation. The different ethnic groups will in the long run disappear because of integration. Still ongoing today, transmigration has been criticized on human rights and environmental fronts, including its role in accelerating deforestation of remote and sensitive rainforest areas. As migrants were often moved to entirely new transmigration villages constructed in regions that had been relatively unimpacted by human activity. And in Borneo in particular, because the soil and climate there are not nearly as productive as the volcanic soils of Java, farmers are often forced to encroach into primary forests to expand their farmlands and support their families. Now, notably, through that transmigration program, newly arriving families were given lots of land that came with formal titles, which stands in marked contrast to the majority of the indigenous communities in Borneo, most of whom live in forests owned by the Indonesian state with no legal claim to their traditional lands. So the Social Forestry Initiative was established in recent years as a way to address this fundamental injustice by improving social welfare and recognizing forest use rights of these marginalized communities. While most research has shown that village managed forests, or hutan desa, tend to experience lower rates of deforestation than their state-managed counterparts, a number of complex socioeconomic, political, historical, and biophysical factors are at play, as you may have read about in Santika and colleagues' paper on community forest management outcomes. In this particular case study in Kalimantan in 2015, community managed forests that were on peat soils in particular that year did not fare very well, but that was largely because of the forest fires that ravaged Borneo that year. So it's complicated. But back to our main story. After months of scoping studies and public speculation, in late August of last year, Jokowi, the president of Indonesia, announced formally that the new capital was going to be located in East Kalimantan, despite that speculation about Palangkaraya and Central Kalimantan. This area is sparsely populated and resource rich, and it's also, of course, Borneo is the island housing Southeast Asia's largest intact forest area. The timeline here is ambitious. Construction was set to begin imminently, with plans to break ground earlier this year and to have a new green city ready to welcome more than 1 million new residents by 2024. Now, Indonesia is the most extensively forested Southeast Asian nation, but at the same time has also experienced some of the world's highest annual rates of forest loss, in 2012 overtaking Brazil. And a lot of this forest loss was concentrated on the island of Borneo. So here we're looking at images of forest cover from 1973 and 2016. And so now today, less than half of the island remains forested. And most of that forest loss is driven by infrastructure expansion, logging, oil palm and wood pulp plantation expansion, and wildfires associated with droughts. And of course, these losses have major implications for climate change mitigation, indigenous livelihoods, and biodiversity conservation. So despite those decades of transformation, the island of Borneo still sustains some of the largest intact forest areas in Southeast Asia, and Kalimantan, which is the Indonesian part of Borneo, harbors 37 million hectares of tropical forest. These diverse forests comprise a global biodiversity hotspot with exceptionally high species endemism, including large numbers of endangered species like Sumatran rhinos, Bornean orangutans, proboscis monkeys, and so many birds and reptiles and plants. It's an incredible place for anyone who's a nature lover. These forests also hold key natural resources and important ecosystem services on which local and indigenous communities rely. And Kalimantan is also a cultural hotspot, home to more than 70 indigenous ethno-linguistic groups depicted in this map here. So zooming into the proposed location for the new capital in East Kalimantan. So we're looking at the eastern coast of Borneo. In East Kalimantan, there are two large cities, Samarinda here in the north and Balikpapan in the south. So the proposal is to build a brand new city sort of situated in between those two to take advantage of some of the existing infrastructure and networks that exist there. So this new area spans, or sorry, it's an existing area, but the area where the new capital is going covers a vast 250,000 hectare area that spans complex mosaic habitats and land uses. 42% of the land cover here comprises forests, including mangroves and peat swamps, and another 31% is in plantation and farmland, including rice paddy, rubber, oil palm, and wood pulp. More than 40% of this area is state-owned and designated as forest estate, which is shown in those yellow and green areas on the map. So roughly half of that is in the Suharto Hill Grand Forest Park, which is a conservation area with multiple management zones for research, biodiversity conservation, and ecotourism. And the remainder in those two green areas are industrial wood plantations in that area. The region also houses these key mangrove areas here at the top of the Balikpapan Bay in particular, and peatland habitats that provide really essential ecosystem functions and have a major role to play in mitigating climate change. But with other forested habitats, they're also home to a number of endemic plants and animals who are threatened with extinction. So we have binturong, Sunda-clouded leopards, Bornean orangutans, and proboscis monkeys who share the terrestrial landscape there, as well as endangered Irrawaddy dolphins that inhabit the coastal areas, as well as the Balikpapan Bay. And within this capital city territory alone, there are more than 500 mining pits. So those little red spots on this map here are mining pits, mostly for coal, located both within and outside these brown concession areas, over 100 of which are more than a hectare in size. So East Kalimantan is one of Indonesia's richest provinces with this intense natural resource-based economy that has at times supplied half of the coal used domestically and up to 2/3 of the country's timber production. Despite its abundance of natural resources, though, East Kalimantan continues to be characterized by marginalized communities and endemic poverty. So the capital area location includes 53 different villages spread over 9 sub-districts. So our collaborators at Yayasan Bumi compiled this map showing the sort of dominant ethnic composition of these different communities throughout the region. And what you can see is that these communities are quite diverse. They comprise indigenous groups like the Pasir Kutai, Bajau, and multiple Dayak ethnicities, as well as non-indigenous ethnicities, including those from Java and Sulawesi Islands, as well as Banjar people. The livelihoods of these communities include farming, fishing, labor for oil palm, wood pulp, and coal mining companies, as well as civil and other service sectors. Now, whereas the Pasir Kutai and Dayak Basap tribes have historically occupied traditional lands here for generations, Dayak Kenya, Tunjung, and Benwak people are indigenous to East Kalimantan, but migrated from the interior parts of Borneo between the 1960s and 1980s. So indigenous and migrant labels here are fraught, as some Bugis and Banjar migrants have occupied the area since the 19th century, and one Bugis group from Sulawesi has existed in Samarinda since the 17th century. So as the region's oil, gas, and coal reserves dwindle, here we're looking at a large coal mining area in the region, and national discourse is shifting towards low carbon energy production, reducing emissions. The provincial government has embraced the idea of green growth and a green economy as strategies to maintain development, to support local communities while maintaining the economic prosperity that the region has known for many years, as well as a frontier for innovations in green resource provisioning and development. So it's not surprising that the president and the national government have unveiled their ambitious plans for a smart, green, beautiful, sustainable city. The new capital is designed to be a forest city grounded in sustainable green development. However, its construction will potentially disrupt endangered terrestrial and marine species habitats, constrain subsistence livelihoods, incentivize frontier expansion, and increase social conflict over land tenure rights that are extremely complicated in this area. So taking into account the region's long history of migration and frontier expansion, the capital relocation to East Kalimantan presents a unique opportunity to understand the forest migration nexus and how this planned climate migration will affect the social ecological system, particularly what that migration means for biodiversity and human well-being for the receiving communities. Monitoring to assess change is fundamental to environmental stewardship, and effective management means that threats and problems are recognized, evaluated, and addressed. By developing this research within a community-led collaborative social ecological monitoring program, our research team aims to explore whether this kind of approach can lead to more just and sustainable solutions for social and environmental policy across one of Indonesia's most imperiled biocultural hotspots. So my own training here is as a primatologist and a behavioral ecologist, and I've been so lucky to conduct research on some of Indonesia's most endangered primates since 2005, driven by a really deep curiosity in the biology and behavior of our closest relatives, as well as a drive to contribute data and actions that support the long-term survival of their wild populations. While I'm incredibly lucky to have spent many years living alongside and learning from indigenous human communities in this forest, my disciplinary training and expertise is squarely in the natural sciences. The scale and the pace of this movement and its cascading effects calls for radical interdisciplinary, multi-species and system level investigation between local and international partners. So I'm so humbled and excited to be conducting this work as part of an incredible team headed by faculty from the Lab of Ornithology, Holger Klink, the Department of City and Regional Planning, Victoria Beard, and Natural Resources, Shorna Allred, in collaboration with the Southeast Asia Program, collectively representing global leaders in bioacoustics research and biodiversity monitoring, urban and community-based infrastructure planning, the social and ecological dimensions of natural resources, and the history and culture of Southeast Asia, all of which will be absolutely essential to understanding and unpacking the social ecological system here. The field research is going to be led by two postdoctoral researchers, myself, an ecologist, and Walker Depew, an anthropologist, who together have a combined 20 years of field research experience in Indonesia, much of it in Borneo, and Walker's own experience in East Kalimantan goes back several years. And we're building our local collaborative team. We've established a partnership with faculty in the Forestry Department's Wildlife Ecology Lab at Universitas Mula Warman, located in Samarinda. So we have Pat Chandra and Pak Rustam there, who I had the great pleasure of exploring the new capital city location in January this year. And we're partnering with a local community rights-based NGO called the Bumi Foundation, that also has a long history and trust built with communities in this area. It's a really exciting team to be working with. So our group is planning to conduct research that integrates social and ecological methods, so particularly ethnographic and participatory research methods, to really capture the diverse cultural landscape that's going to be affected by the migration, and to think about how the local knowledge there can help us better understand and track these impacts. We will combine that with ecological methods, in particular GIS and bioacoustic approaches, to map and track forest and biodiversity change across the landscape, with the ultimate goal of understanding how the human and non-human communities here exist and interact before, during, and after this historic climate-based migration. And although, of course, our project integrates all these multiple disciplines and fields and research approaches today, I really want to zoom in on one specific dimension of this work that I'll be leading, and that's naturally bioacoustics. So let me put on my conservationist hat for a moment and talk about the potential for bioacoustics to monitor and respond to ecosystem change and biodiversity loss. So given the fact that we have limited resources and the change that's happening is really fast, the threats that face the forest and biodiversity there are numerous and quickly moving. So conservationists have been challenged to find more efficient methods to design and monitor strategies to preserve not only Borneo's, but around the world, unique biodiversity, carbon stocks, and valuable ecosystem services. Now, a holistic strategy that targets these myriad resources needs to happen at a landscape scale. And so there are really great logistical challenges for monitoring change and success at the scale of the landscape. And so remote sensing methods have been particularly useful for studying ecological systems undergoing rapid change at large spatial and temporal scales. But satellite-based methods can miss important information about habitat quality and degradation. For instance, understory fires or resource extraction that can affect the biodiversity that lives in those forests, even if it hasn't fundamentally changed the forest cover. So here's where bioacoustics comes in. But before we dig into the science here, allow me to indulge you with a recording of a Bornean rainforest. While you're listening and watching the spectrogram, I encourage you to imagine yourself in this forest. What do you notice? How do you feel? What sounds grab your attention? So if you're like me, your blood pressure probably dropped a bit listening to those sounds. I'm immediately transformed by sound, and I hope you did too. So it's here that bioacoustics offers this really exciting approach. If we compare it to traditional survey methods, animal sounds can be studied in a broad range of ecosystems that might be difficult to observe, like underwater. And sounds can be recorded and analyzed relatively easily and cheaply. And we can use these tools to estimate the densities and sizes and movements of endangered species and invasive species of conservation interest. Because animal sounds can be sensitive and particularly respond quite instantaneously to human activities, including fragmentation, urbanization, hunting, noise pollution, these acoustic changes can serve as an early warning indicator of anthropogenic threats, as well as a way to measure species responses to threats and conservation strategies. So the use of bioacoustics is growing rapidly as advances in collection and analysis allow us to collect data over larger areas and in increasingly difficult environments and from even the most cryptic species. So when conservation targets landscapes comprising entire ecological communities, assessing the effectiveness of conservation efforts is particularly difficult as it's impossible to monitor all species in a community. And so under these circumstances, one possible solution is to select one or a few indicator species that can be easily monitored. The best indicator species are those that are sensitive to environmental stresses and whose response to different types of disturbance is generally known from previous research. So a really great example of an indicator species is this Galapagos penguin. The Center for Ecosystem Sentinels has been monitoring their population since 1970s. And through that research, they've carefully documented the impacts of climate change as these penguins show great sensitivity to warming waters during El Nino events that cause food shortages and lead to reproductive failures in their populations. Now, indicator species are the ecological equivalent of canaries in the coal mine, an allusion to the caged canaries that miners carried into mine tunnels in the 20th century. And canaries are good early detectors of carbon monoxide because they're vulnerable to airborne poisons since they need a lot of oxygen for their high altitude flight. And so they get high volumes of air at a quick pace. So if dangerous gases like carbon monoxide are accumulated in a mine, it would kill the canary first, providing an early warning to the miners to exit immediately. So much of my work so far in Borneo has sought to apply this principle to Borneo's endangered apes, the very charismatic orangutans and gibbons. And these species have long been recognized as iconic flagship species for conservation of the island's threatened forests, but may also be excellent indicators of ecosystem health. So I'm going to play a sound for you. So this is the Bornean orangutan sound. This is the long call. This is a call that is audible over 1 kilometer in the forest. So it's usually pretty easily heard by humans as well as by autonomous recorders. So here's an orangutan. And that goes on for a while longer. And then the other very charismatic ape with a beautiful song. This is the Bornean gibbon of Central Kalimantan, which sounds a bit different from the ones of East Kalimantan, but you'll get the idea. So this is a female great call. Okay. So yeah, this is a really sort of well-known and valuable approach to addressing species level conservation. It can be used to also protect habitats as these are very forest dependent species that rely on and require a lot of high quality forests to meet their needs. So by focusing on a species like this and targeting their conservation, you can sort of capture a lot of other important species that are part of that ecosystem. Now, scaling up, we can actually, rather than measure the specific number of calls of a species like a gibbon or an orangutan in a habitat through these sound recordings, we can actually make the soundscape the unit of our measurement. So with the loss of habitat and biodiversity, lots of areas have been losing their natural sounds. And these natural sounds have been referred to as an endangered resource, as the ability to experience them becomes increasingly rare, while at the same time, the reach of human-generated sounds like trucks and airplanes and cities and cars and mining explosions spread across the planet and penetrate deeper into natural areas. So using soundscapes to monitor ecosystem function and sustainability as a way to also potentially indicate biodiversity is a way to use soundscape recordings to research the effects of land use change. So here's just a really quick kind of visual of what this looks like. Here's one of my field team members, Eric, in central Kalimantan. He's climbed up a tree there. He's putting an autonomous recorder. We load it with batteries and SD cards, hit record, and then go back and collect the data some weeks later. And so when you make these recordings, you end up getting sounds that are recorded from these different 3 classes of sound sources: biophony, so these are biological sounds; geological sounds; and human sounds. And so you analyze all of those signals together. We often use artificial intelligence, machine learning tools to process those data. And from there, we can sort of separate out the different sound profiles. You can do this across time, within the time of a day, across seasons, across spatial scales. It's an incredibly powerful tool. And just to kind of demonstrate a very recent application of this coming from members of my research team community at the Center for Conservation Bioacoustics. Here we're looking at kind of the sound profiles shown in 2-dimensional space here of different forests in Malaysia, Indonesia, New Zealand, and even our own Ithaca here. So the brown and the pink is there at Sapsucker Woods here in Ithaca. So it's a really interesting way to kind of look at the level of an ecosystem and to be able to track changes through time and over space. Another really cool thing that you can do with this approach is detect things like chainsaws, gunshots, chopping sounds, talking sounds, as a way to sort of measure the way that people's interactions with these habitats might be changing over time. So thinking beyond soundscapes for their ability to track biodiversity or measure ecosystems, we can also think about the value that soundscapes bring to humans. So one thing that is pretty well documented through research in the social and psychological sciences is looking at the effects of sounds on people's health and well-being. So it's pretty well established that loud sounds, they can damage hearing, they can cause stress, disrupt sleep, and cause even cardiovascular effects. Whereas often natural sounds are found to be soothing, reducing stress, promoting tranquility and well-being. Another way that soundscapes support human value is by creating a sense of place. Cultural, historical, and natural locations convey unique sounds that meaningfully can connect humans to that place. And in this way, soundscapes are integral to the way that people observe and understand their local environments and their relationships to them. And there's been an increasing interest in integrating these local knowledge systems, a sense of place, often referred to as traditional or local or indigenous ecological knowledge, into monitoring programs to create more complete understandings of social and ecological systems. And so you can see there's been an increasing trend, particularly over the last 2 decades, to engage indigenous people, local people, into different environmental monitoring programs that incorporates that traditional and local knowledge there. And these knowledge systems emerge from the lived relationships between people and their traditional places, relationships that involve resource use, stewardship, oral histories, and spirituality that often also guide political governance systems. And it's pretty well established that scientific and indigenous ways of knowing provide different yet complementary information that can enrich our understanding of social ecological systems and health. And it's not just that engaging local knowledge systems can support better monitoring, but it's also a path to make research more equitable and sustainable and less extractive. And though these studies incorporating traditional local knowledge rarely integrate soundscapes as a measure of social ecological change, there are some interesting examples where animal sounds have been highlighted in local knowledge systems. So for instance, Schaefer's research on rural Tanzanian communities highlighted local knowledge about climate change observed through a lot of different things, but including the sounds of birds. One observer noting that if you hear the mumbi in December, it will rain 1 week later. This bird has been very confused in recent times. It calls at the wrong time. So this local person is using the sound of this ground hornbill in Tanzania to indicate or to note that the climate has changed in that area. And so I couldn't resist looking these birds up as I was reading about this research, and was not disappointed to find these really beautiful animals, but also check out these wild sounds. So musical, it's amazing. I could listen to that much longer. But I'm sensitive to the fact that we have limited time here together. So at this stage, it's too early to share with you in any detail about how our team is going to integrate local knowledge systems into bioacoustics research on social ecological change. You know, it's deciding what we're going to pay attention to and how we're going to monitor and where. Those are all decisions that need to be made with and by local community members. But I think Kim Lee Thompson and colleagues have outlined an exciting approach to developing and conducting this research with and for local communities. And so this was a diagram published in their recent paper, We Monitor by Living Here, community-driven actualization of a social ecological monitoring program based in the knowledge of indigenous harvesters. And I don't want to go through this figure in too much detail, but I think the main things to pay attention here is that this is a very iterative process. It involves multiple stages. Each stage involves multiple stakeholders, including researchers from universities, tribal leaders, and community members that are involved in all stages of designing, planning, and implementing the research that I hope will guide us in our upcoming discussions with community members once we arrive in Borneo. Our local partners there, particularly at the Bumi Foundation, have developed a knowledge of and trust with the communities in this area and the new capital location, and they will be really instrumental in guiding and facilitating this process of co-development. So beyond the possibilities for collaborative and community-led research into the social ecological system of East Kalimantan, bioacoustics is rich with opportunities to connect with other people. And I'm really excited to carry on with the work that I've done in Borneo to build capacity and to deepen people's connections with nature. Here are a couple of examples of programs that I've been excited to lead in Central Kalimantan last summer, my research team and I. So here is Eric and Rito's hiding there. These are my two local community members that work on my bioacoustics research team that helped to teach this bioacoustics training workshop that included local professors from Central Kalimantan universities, as well as from other experts from Java, students, staff from NGOs, community members. We even had members of the media who came to cover the event and ended up participating in the training from start to finish. And so there was a really great interest in building on this foundation. And I'm excited to expand and continue this work also in collaboration with Universitas Mulu Warman. I also really love connecting with kids. And so the last summer when we did this training workshop, I also teamed up with the Borneo Nature Foundation to teach high school kids in the local village that's closest to our research camp in Central Kalimantan to raise awareness about local conservation issues and increase their interest in biodiversity and conservation. And our goal is to work together to create even more lessons that are intended to bring sounds to a larger audience in Kalimantan and hopefully throughout Indonesia to connect people and nature using sound. And on a personal note, this project creates a perfect opportunity to build on and expand the 15 years of experience and engagement that I've had in Indonesia to date, emphasizing this long-term interdisciplinary research that's multilateral, inclusive, and ultimately should empower local people to manage and protect their own resources. So I hope to achieve this by studying the complex relationships between local people and their environments and how environmental changes impact their health and livelihoods and well-being. By building these multi-stakeholder partnerships that include communities, universities, NGOs, the private sector, and government as collaborators. By developing community outreach programs aimed at raising awareness about local environmental issues and build support for preserving healthy ecosystems for people and animals. And finally, by training and mentoring students, particularly in Indonesia, to generate these new research skills, experiences, and opportunities that are integral to long-term conservation success in Indonesia. And collectively, with my team, through this integrative and collaborative research agenda, we explicitly aim for this project to be inclusive and adaptive with contributions that span and integrate academic disciplines, and in particular by collaborating with communities from the start to integrate their local knowledge. We strive for this work to be centered on the ethics of sharing and relations of equity. And by combining bioacoustics and cultural anthropology in particular, we're excited to develop new methods to understand the human and environmental impacts of migration and development. And our hope is that this project lays the groundwork for longitudinal international and interdisciplinary collaboration that will expand and develop as the capital migration unfolds in Indonesia, while at the same time providing a strong evidentiary basis for social and environmental policy in Indonesia and beyond. And with that, I would really like to thank you all for your attention and for the opportunity to talk to you about this really exciting work today. And I can take any questions. I'm going to figure out how to stop sharing my screen.
Hi, Wendy. I'll go ahead and come on for the Q&A part. Thank you so much for just such an interesting talk. And I loved hearing the sounds. So thank you for sharing those recordings. It's just a really wonderful, you talk a little bit about sense of place. So it's really wonderful to get some sense for me who's unfamiliar with those sites, but just to get a sense of, you know, this oral sense of what it's like there. So thank you. And I'll just remind the audience that you're welcome to add questions in the Q&A. And we already have a couple questions and comments. You can also upvote questions that you see that you want to make sure are asked by clicking the little thumbs up there. So I'll wait and see as a few more questions come in. And I'll go ahead and get our questions started with, I guess it's just, I was thinking while you were talking about what a compelling project this is, both because it's a massive project for the site where it's taking place. But this also strikes me as a project that, I mean, the moving of the capital and also the research that you all are producing as a project that the the world is watching as we think into the coming decades about what we're going to have to do and how we're going to think about meeting people's needs and holding ecological questions in mind at the same time. So with that in mind, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the different ways that the disciplines that your team brings together are going to, how are you integrating these disciplines, or what kinds of different contributions do you expect someone from city planning to make? How do you bring city planning together with bioacoustics? Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I would be happy to. And, I think the first thing that I have to say is that I think we've only scratched the surface, even in really thinking about all the different ways that this could, as I said, it's going to be a project that hopefully just continues to evolve and unfold over the coming years as the project unfolds. Because, right now we're in this situation where the government is in intense study and planning phase. And, as I mentioned early in the talk, the plan was that in 2020 that ground would be broken, everything was moving towards that direction. And then unfortunately, Indonesia has been one of the harder hit countries in the region with the COVID pandemic. And so, there was kind of a tension for a while between moving forward with the development plans or delaying things. And right now, the place that the planning stands is that, the government's limited resources really need to focus on making sure that the population gets stewarded through the immediate health and economic needs of the population. And so the project has been postponed sort of without a clear indication of exactly when. We're in a time of great uncertainty, and it's really going to be unclear as to when the groundbreaking will happen. But I guess to say that there are so many different stages of the relocation, right? Like at this stage, there's not been any infrastructure development, but when I was there in January, meeting with our future collaborators and kind of getting a feel for the landscape there, one thing that was quite noticeable was the for sale signs that were everywhere along the road to that capital location. So I imagine that things are already kind of changing, like to think that we will be getting in and getting like a real baseline before anything is changed. That ship's probably already sailed, but at least we'll be at the stage where construction hasn't begun. Then we'll be in the construction phase. Then we'll be in the phase when the civil servants and communities from Jakarta and of course other parts of of Borneo and Indonesia will be moving there. We can think about the ways that we integrate those disciplines across each of those stages. For now, I would say our main focus has really been on developing the community-led, collaborative, social-ecological monitoring project. And so how we can integrate the experiences and the literature from these different disciplines to pull together something that can simultaneously kind of address some of the big picture questions that ecology and conservation is interested in asking, and at the same time getting a deeper understanding of these communities' relationships to their environments and the deep cultural and traditional knowledges that they hold. So I think that those are some of the really exciting things that we're really focused on developing that particular piece. So it's such a big question, and I feel like I could probably talk about it for 20 minutes. It's a hard one to answer concisely. Sorry if I rambled.
No, that's great. And it's also exciting to hear about the project as it's still taking shape. So I guess that's also something I would imagine that will take working out as you go and as you learn the different directions that the project will need to go in. It sounds like a significant part of the project is monitoring, but do you also envision being able to make some kind of intervention or being in touch with, I mean, is the government interested in hearing from local groups about what they're learning about their spaces? Yeah, what are the possibilities for intervention there?
That's such a great question. And, that's always the question that we want to bring ourselves back to and remind ourselves that there's this purpose here. The really exciting thing about the folks that we're teaming up with is that they are currently directly involved in developing a lot of the studies and building the evidence to guide the national government planning strategy for how and where and why to develop different kinds of infrastructure and what kinds of policies are needed to preserve the wildlife and protect marginalized communities there. So for instance, one of our collaborators, Rustam, at Universitas Mula Warman, has been conducting camera trap surveys in the area for the last decade. And he specializes in large mammals and cats. And so a lot of the work that he's been doing is documenting the patterns of biodiversity across this landscape. I sort of gave you a hint as to the complexity of the land cover and land use and different habitat types there. But the bigger picture is how to maintain connectivity across the landscape so that these forest dependent creatures are still able to basically facilitate wildlife migration across that landscape and make sure that those populations can be sustained as well. So in that sense, we're really quite well positioned to have these members of our team from the university, as well as our NGO partner, who are directly working with the National Planning Department to form the plan. And so the hope is that we're able to maintain the ear and interest of the national government, but I really don't think that that's going to be a problem, because Rustam seems to be quite well integrated and respected, as well as Yaya Sanbumi in terms of like feeding in the social and ecological dimensions. And our team, I think everybody from the Cornell side and the Indonesian side really is fully on board with this, like engaging the social and ecological sciences to pursue this. So that is the hope.
Great. I'm gonna take a couple questions from the Q&A, and Wendy, feel free to pop in here too if you see one that you really want to get to. But I see one that's directly related to the role of the government. So this comes from Sophie Shriver. Thank you so much for the interesting presentation. The move of Jakarta was often framed as climate change induced migration in the media. Does the Indonesian government make use of this as well? I guess of this, do they make use of this particular framing to talk about the move?
Yeah, so absolutely. I was hoping I would have a little bit more time to add some slides from the research that one of our Einaudi interns did this summer. So Dea did this really cool, she did a media analysis where she looked at when and how often and where articles on the Indonesian capital relocation were published. And so really interestingly, like these articles are going back into the 90s. As I mentioned, it's not a new idea. It's sort of been floated multiple times, seemed to coincide with political happenings in Indonesia, particularly situated close to presidential elections. And certainly a lot of it is being framed. So like kind of thinking about like the way that the national government is communicating why East Kalimantan in particular was chosen as a new site for the capital city has a lot to do with environmental risks. So, you know, apart from those climate related risks like sea level change, and different forms of pollution, there's also, I don't know how much folks know about the geological history of Indonesia, but it's called the Ring of Fire because there's all these volcanoes and it's like extremely geologically active part of the world, lots of earthquakes. So one of the ways that East Kalimantan in particular is kind of sold as like a great place, is that it's inland, it's not as prone to earthquakes, it's in a hilly area, so less prone to flooding. And another really interesting kind of part of the narrative, and I don't want to get too much into the complexity of the history of the transmigration program and some of the social conflicts that it's been connected to in Borneo, but one of the explicit reasons that the Indonesian government has given again for choosing East Kalimantan is that it is actually the province with the highest proportion of people that were not born in that province. So the population is largely migrant. Now, it's not just Javanese, it could be people from other provinces in Indonesia as well, or Kalimantan as well. And so that's kind of the argument, is that it's a place of like social harmony, and like all these different ethnicities can get along without social strife and conflict. So there's all of these conversations happening at once. And then of course Jokowi, the president, he's sort of if you look at his Instagram page, it's all these pictures of him in construction hats, like out serving different projects. He's sort of well known as an infrastructure development president, and really kind of has this vision for development and building new things. And so, there's also all this language around green development and smart cities and the best city and a beautiful city and sustainable city. So it's not like one single message, but yeah, it's not just spoken about in purely climate change related terms, but also in overcrowding, traffic, and pollution are also dimensions of that. So maybe not explicitly framed as global climate change migration.
Okay, I'm gonna, oh, the questions are coming in. My order is switching up. I'm gonna read this question from Braden Preston in our migrations course, who says, I feel the internal relocation we're beginning to see in Indonesia is pretty unique, that most climate-induced migrations would cross national boundaries. Could you comment on the broader patterns of climate migration you've seen in this region, so to, from, or outside of Indonesia?
Yeah, that is a great question. I mean, certainly Borneo in particular has been characterized by, so, I didn't really mention this, but Borneo itself actually is made up of 3 different countries. So there's Indonesia, which is the Indonesian part of Borneo is called Kalimantan. And then Malaysia has 2 states there, Sarawak and Sabah. And then Brunei is the 3rd country that occupies a very small portion of Borneo in the northwest. And so certainly there is a long history of different nomadic indigenous groups kind of moving across Borneo, and with or without concern for where those national and provincial and state boundaries are. And there is a very long history of those kinds of migration patterns in that area. Some of those can be sort of environmentally related, maybe not like large scale climate changes, but just as kind of resources shift and opportunities expand and develop in different areas, people kind of tend to follow those. But in thinking about other kind of climate migration in the area, yeah, I can't really think of a lot of other really great examples to sort of create that broader context for how unusual this is. Like, and also because, yeah, go ahead.
Is there something, I was thinking about what you talked about at the very beginning of your talk about the long onset events or short onset events. Is there something more seasonal that happens related to the climate or temporary moves that you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, this area, Indonesia certainly had its share of just, wow, I mean, in the 15 years that I've worked there. There was a giant tsunami in Aceh. There have been countless earthquakes and mudslides and so many forest fires. I thought 2015 was terrible for forest fires. 2019 was also equally terrible. And so, you know, the kinds of, I haven't really seen any, at least in the places where I'm working, in the communities that I'm working with, haven't really seen any like permanent migration that's related to those environmental changes. People sort of tend to stick it out or temporarily move and come back. And that seems to sort of bear out with like what the larger trends are. I mean, obviously, like every place is going to be different, but the sort of larger, broader research that's happening on these slow versus rapid onset events is that the rapid onset events tend to lead to temporary migration, and then people return to those areas. And usually if people don't return, they're typically moving into urban areas. So, I mean, that's another kind of dimension of this project, and thinking about like how migration patterns within East Kalimantan are also going to change as there's a new urban center that brings in opportunities and will obviously lead to secondary and subsequent migrations.
Great. We have another regional question, so I'll go ahead and bring that in while we're on the topic, from Laura Miranda, another of our migration students. And I think I'm going to start, so there's two related posts. So as social scientists, the question comes mostly from the social sciences perspective. In the spirit of trying to keep this within your natural science expertise, I want to ask you about other regions of Indonesia that seem to face similar challenges as Borneo. I'm mostly thinking of West Papua. There seems to be a pattern of exploitation of environmentally and resource-rich regions that are mostly culturally distinct from the mainland. This clearly affects wildlife. How do you see similarities in the environmental impacts, and what are the differences? Are there any common solutions? And then a big question for last, could regions such as West Papua that seek independence deal with these issues without a large central government? So lots of possible questions to take up there. But to start, asking about other regions of Indonesia that might face similar challenges. The similarities and differences across the region.
Yeah, absolutely. What a great and insightful question. And, you know, it's, I always find Indonesia to be just like the most fascinating place to talk about, because sometimes I get so comfortable just talking about Indonesia, like it's this thing. And then when I start like looking at a map of Indonesia and seeing all these different islands, and then realizing like even at the island level, there's just so much heterogeneity across Indonesia. It's incredible, the diversity of languages and cultures and culinary items and histories and, you know, unique batik styles even. At sometimes it can be hard to see what brings everything together, and then sometimes that's the thing that you notice. So, you know, the question, I forget the person's name who asked, was it Laura? It's a good one, and it reminds me of the connectedness across Indonesia and how these experiences do resonate across so many islands. So Borneo is certainly not unique in being a place of really rich resources, natural resources, and marginalized communities and endangered species. Like that basically describes just about every island in Indonesia. And because of like the amazing evolutionary history of these islands, just about every island has its unique floral and faunal composition. And the same thing that's happening in Borneo is really happening everywhere. And, you know, it's really interesting for me because I was in Borneo last July, like right in August. Like I got home, I think 2 days before Jokowi announced that East Kalimantan was selected. And when I was in Central Kalimantan, the secretary of the governor in Central Kalimantan had attended an event, a workshop that we'd put on, and was talking about how the capital city is going to come to Palangkaraya, and we're going to have like this great green city, and you know, this place where you guys are doing all this like cool ecological research, it's going to become like a big park or place for ecotourism. And you know, we're just all kind of like biting our nails, like, oh my gosh, it's coming, and what are we going to do? And so there was like a sense of relief to some extent that it was going to East Kalimantan, but then also this like, you know, that relief lasted for an instant, because it's just like the problems there and the challenges there are not different from the challenges here. There are communities there that are struggling for recognition of their land rights. Same in East Kalimantan as in Central Kalimantan. And same in West Papua, with indigenous communities that are fighting for recognition of their land rights. These same communities that have been affected by transmigration policies. You know, West Papua, Papua in general, has its own history and policing and violence that's probably been more extreme there in other parts of the archipelago. But you know, certainly the challenges with respect to preserving unique and really diverse ecological areas with high biodiversity is something that's experienced across Indonesia, and the fight for indigenous communities to be able to manage their own natural resources is something that's experienced across Indonesia. So, you know, it's a big question. There's, I wouldn't even say that there are two camps, but there are lots of different people working on human rights and conservation issues, doing them together in different ways, trying to find solutions. Everybody wants to find scalable solutions, right? Like to find the thing that's just gonna like be the policy that works for all of Indonesia, all of Southeast Asia, all of the world. And I think, you know, we all kind of grapple with how much scaling can really be done to get effective solutions. I think the approach that we're taking is village by village, community by community, and that you really kind of have to appreciate and listen to the unique experiences and value systems of each of those places, because otherwise you just run the risk of missing something important or perpetuating unjust practices.
Thanks for that response. We have a couple of questions connected to challenges. So I'll start with Vanessa Olguins. She asks, she says, I was wondering about the relationship between the communities of Borneo with the Indonesian government. Has there been any pushback on the relocation to East Kalimantan, or perhaps any pushback by conservation groups against this new development? And then we have a second question, I'll get to that in just a second, about extra-legal rights issues.
Yeah, this is another really great question, another point where I'm regretting not incorporating Dea's media analysis research into this talk. But one of the things that she discovered in her review of, you know, the international and national coverage of the capital relocation is that very few articles, and most of them from pretty predictable sources like Mongabe, have really focused on the impacts of the receiving communities. Most of the media coverage and most of the sort of national level discourse and international discourse is really kind of focused on the problems that face Jakarta and the immediate need to address those problems. And of course, there are lots of critics who say moving 1.5 million people from one place to another doesn't actually fix anything in Jakarta, because there's still going to be like 9 million people and growing in that city. And so there's lots of critics of that. But I think, yeah, that's sort of been, that's our sense, that's the sense of the people that we're working with in East Kalimantan, is that these communities have not been centered in these discussions. They have not been a dominant part of the conversation. They are certainly mobilizing and organizing and making demands of their own. The kinds of traction that they're getting, it's difficult to say at this stage. Some of the demands that they have are related to preserving the cultural uniqueness and integrity of that area by incorporating different Dayak and other indigenous groups' symbolism into architecture and artwork, into the city planning. And there are some really interesting proposals to take the existing customary land management practices that have been developed and utilized in that area for a really long time to build this concept of the forest city that is talked about so much. So what is the forest city? I guess the idea is that people are living in some kind of harmony with nature, where people are getting their basic needs in an urban environment while maintaining the biodiversity and the integrity of the ecological system. So, there's certainly conversations going on. I think most of the NGOs are really quite concerned, obviously, about the biodiversity there, as well as the local communities there. But, how much that's going to be taken into account as ground is broken and as land rights are recognized or not recognized certainly remains to be seen, although historically not the best track record for recognizing local people's rights in that area. Although the social forestry initiative has been something that I think people have put a lot of hope into, and it certainly has increased the number of community managed areas across Indonesia. Though the initial targets, I think, were around 12 million hectares would be returned to community management. We're at 4 million, so still really quite far from the original targets. So slowly moving in that direction, though, with the national government basically saying this 500,000 or 250,000 hectare area is now state land. Maybe doesn't bode super well for those communities existing there.
So I'm going to follow that then with this question from Edelyn Ferretti, who says, advocating for and acting on behalf of effective and equitable resource conservation and community land rights in the Kalimantan provinces have often triggered violent, sometimes sadly lethal responses from extra-legal entities. Might you be able to say anything about the impact that the capital's move has on that issue? Might having the center closer to the periphery actually affect an improvement there? So perhaps greater effective control by civil society over public or community resources.
It's such a great question, and I really appreciate the reminder in case that wasn't really communicated, and it really wasn't. There is, of course, a potential that things are going to get better for some people, right? There will be more opportunities. There will be more services. There will be economic development, maybe improved healthcare and education. It won't all be bad, right? There will be some positive things that come out of it, and could even be a push to really make sure that some of these areas are recognized for the customary areas for the local groups that are there. Really interestingly, thinking about the extra legal entities, the question was framed around kind of violence, and gosh, East Kalimantan is like a relatively new place for me. I haven't worked in that province yet. In Central Kalimantan, oh my gosh, the politics around forest fires and peatland fires is wild. And actually, as I mentioned, the forest fires in 2019 were really terrible. And the governor, the secretary to the governor in Central Kalimantan had some very public statements sort of connecting the increase of the forest fires in that area to the decision to move the capital. because fire is often used as a way for people to get land rights recognized. Customarily, you clear an area of land and it's yours. And so different groups have better access to pulling those administrative legal levers to get legitimate land right recognition there. What was I going to say for East Kalimantan land recognition? I was going to say that for the Hutan Desa, the community forests, is one of these social forestry initiative classifications. A big chunk of the communities that have successfully gotten those designations have done so with support and facilitation by non-government organizations in sort of helping them to navigate. It's like a complicated, bureaucratic, not free, involves like many administrative and bureaucratic steps to get that status recognized. And so there's an interesting example there of non-governmental entities supporting local communities getting legal recognition of their rights. So it can sort of go both ways, can't it?
We just have a couple minutes left. So and there are so many great questions on here. And I just want to point out that several people have jumped on just to say thanks for such a great talk and what an exciting project. So I'm sorry we won't be able to get to all these questions. I want to ask about something that you've brought up a couple of times in different ways, which is what's going to happen to Jakarta as the capital moves. And I wonder if people have, to what extent people have already speculated on this, and maybe thinking about this in terms of migration. I guess my main question here is, what are people saying about who will be making this move and who is likely to stay? It looks like the kind of plan that is, you mentioned ecotourism in another moment of this talk. I mean, it looks like a big green city that could also attract a lot of international investment. And, that raises a lot of questions about who it's being built for, I guess, is part of what I'm asking. So is the thought that a lot of residents of Jakarta would also be brought away from the risks that the city is facing?
Yeah, also your question really highlights the scales, the growing scales that you can really look at this project from, and in the sending and the receiving communities. So the social scientists on this research collaboration are trying to get at some of these questions in our pandemic life by conducting Zoom interviews, thank goodness for Zoom, and talking to different key stakeholders at all different levels, from international levels, international NGOs, international investors, folks at the national level in governments and NGOs, down all the way to the village level, to sort of get an idea of the spread of perceptions that folks have about who made this decision, how, why, who's benefiting from it, what is going to happen to Jakarta, who's going to move. I think sort of the predictions based on, there are lots of new cities being built all over the world. Indonesia isn't the only one doing this. And there's sort of a collective understanding that most of these new cities, they're nice, new, sophisticated cities, are really for the elite classes. And so there's a huge concern about projects like this that are really going to perpetuate existing inequities. So there's a big concern that the folks that are going to be moving are the people of the upper class, people with economic stability and good education, mostly in the government sector, because this new capital city, Jakarta is still going to retain its status as an economic powerhouse for the country. And East Kalimantan is going to be the seat of government. And what universities are going to do, don't know. Are they going to move there's so many universities in Jakarta. Are those universities going to move? There's just like a huge question about who's going to be involved in building the city. Local people in East Kalimantan are like, those should be our jobs. But historically, these big corporations come into these areas and make promises like, it's going to be jobs for local people. We promise we're going to hire local people. You do a Google search, you'll find a dozen articles of communities that have been promised economic opportunities that never come to them, because these companies like bring international or interprovincial labor force with them to do these jobs. So I think the large concern is about creating, deepening the existing inequity. And I haven't seen any clear legislative proposal to make sure that that doesn't happen through some kind of really clear policy.
It will be really, really interesting to follow your project also to better understand how those dynamics end up playing out. Thank you again so much for the talk and for sharing your work with us. Thanks to all of you for your great questions. I'm going to try and send some of these to you, Wendy, in case you want to follow up on the ones that we couldn't take in this time. And I'll also just remind everyone, we're not meeting next week for one of these lectures, but we will be here again on the 11th of November talking about climate change and oceanic migrations with Aaron Rice and Michelle Fournet from the Lab of Ornithology. So looking forward to that talk and to seeing you all here again in a couple of weeks. Thanks everyone. Thanks Wendy once again.
Thank you all so much. I appreciate the opportunity. Have a great